Benoit. I am the interim chair of the Folklore Mythology program. And I've been sitting through this wonderful conference with these terrific papers as a hopeless Hoosier. And someone who grew up saying Appalachia. But also wondering about the etymology of this place name. And as I'm sure some of you here already know, it's actually named after an indigenous people of central Florida. And it's probably a 16th century. And supposedly, in the indigenous language of the Appalachee, it means on the other side. So something for us to think about, and actually quite relevant to much of what we've heard already. So today we're going to be hearing from this is going back to Donald's question at the beginning of the morning. Yes, it's wonderful to see all these folklorists here. You're all welcome to Harvard. I'm delighted to have you here. But I must say our speaker, Professor Lindahl, is truly a star in the folkloristic sky. And his name is well known, I'm sure, to all of us in the business. It is also great to welcome back a Harvard alumnus to Harvard. I wish I could say that you concentrated in folklore mythology, but you concentrated in English. But then you went off to Indiana University, where you did do the PhD in folklore. And at this point, there's a little bit of personal information I have to share with you. And Carl, I don't think I've ever shared this even with you. As a fellow Hungarian-American, I spent a good deal of time with the late, great Professor Lindahl of Indiana University. And Carl, in our many discussions, Linda had many things to say about many folklorists. But there were only two folklorists that I know of whom she had only good things to say. And you were one of them. So I think that really makes you stand out.
She saved her insults for me.
Well, she was Hungarian, so but anyway, Professor Lindahl has contributed so widely to the field of folklore, and he's a wonderful example of how folklore can be both the study of living traditions, but also the study of past traditions, as reflected to us in texts and various other sources of information. So he has built up a remarkable cachet as a scholar of both medieval folklore and also of modern folklore. We all know him, of course, for his work on folk tales, and the Jack tales in particular, and their relevance to Appalachian traditions, and so much more. And we always look forward to publications by Professor Lindahl in book form or in article form, or the many works that he has edited. Truly a very, very wide-ranging and very, very productive scholar. So the title of his presentation for us today, which in fact includes the name of one of his famous sources of storytelling. The title is Loyal Jones, Mountain Tricksters, and the Social Contract. So please help me in welcoming back here to a Harvard podium Professor Carl Lindahl from the University of Houston.
Thank you, Yoshi. That was extraordinary. This is a bit of a ghost talk, and I need to apologize for that. First, this is a ghost talk. I've been living in COVID quarantine for more than 4 years, and this is only the second time since March 19, 2020 that I've been let loose into a room filled with living people to talk about anything. I'm not of this world anymore. You have no reason to believe anything that I'll be saying. But thanks so much to Sarah Craycroft and to the Folklore Mythology program here for bringing me in to this and in presenting me with the ghost of who I was, because my conversion experience in folklore happened right here. But the dominant ghost in this room, and every room I've entered for over the past 7 months, since his passing last October, is Loyal Jones, who's been on my mind continually from January 2023, when he wrote to tell me that he'd been diagnosed with a cancer he decided not to treat. He didn't have to tell me why. 5 years earlier, he had suffered a long and devastating medical catastrophe involving multiple surgeries and therapies and effects from which he never fully recovered. And he had no intention of repeating that experience. But Loyal's refusal was in no way a surrender. In March 2023, he wrote me, in his words, "I had a hospice doctor come to see me, and I told him that even though I'm in hospice care, I still have obligations to try to fulfill. I have letters, and I have a memoir to write." Without commentating on my obligations, the doctor suggested that one of my options was to quit eating and thus hasten my departure. I said I'd be willing to talk about that later, but as of now, I had the obligations about which I'd spoken. Then, at the end of our short visit, he brought up the option again. I got him reassigned. So Loyal lived on another 6 months. He finished his memoir, manuscript a week before his passing, lucid all the way, in full possession of the same soft-spoken but indomitable determination that marked every one of his 96 years. Sophocles warns not to judge a life until it's safely over, and it's hard to think otherwise than that Loyal got and gave as much good out of his life as is humanly possible. But it's precisely for that same reason that I cannot help but miss him and feel the need to talk about him today. And as we're all talking about betwixt and between, he's the big bookend of that, betwixt and between. And invoking him now is one of the best ways to get to the other side of that, the betwixt. Most notably missing in this talk will be, of course, Loyal's voice. And I've set myself up in an impossible situation of trying to quote him without being able to channel the way he could speak about these things in any conceivable way. So this is kind of a tale without the teller that you're going to be hearing. Loyal's here, but you'll have to use your memories to make his voice present in ways that I just simply can't. To my mind, he is the finest folklorist who never claimed to be one. He said from time to time he was an amateur folklorist. Most of the time he said he was not. Sometimes he said he dabbled, but then he produced a couple armfuls of books which might lead us to believe he was a folklorist. Books about his famous predecessors, Bascom and Mama Lunsford, great folk singers like Bradley Kincaid, and then 6 or 7 books on Appalachian jokes, some of them co-authored with Billy Ed Wheeler, one of his classmates from Korea way back in the 1950s. And then books exploring Appalachian folk religiosity, Faith and Meaning in the Southern Uplands, I think is a really strong one. And then Appalachian Values, in which he articulated core precepts of his region's community culture. And after that was published in 1994, it's been revisited more than a couple of times, where Loyal would reflect on it and tweak it a little bit on demand from others who wanted to know if those values still existed. The books alone might tempt us to see him primarily in the light of a publishing folklorist, but it was primarily everything else he did that made him even more a folklorist. And any short sketch of what he called my gratifying but somewhat haphazard career invites us to consider the many ways in which he involved himself in every aspect of folk culture. He was a longtime leader of the Council of the Southern Mountains, where he advocated for fairness in labor and combated rural poverty. As a lover of Appalachian music, he founded Berea College's annual celebration of traditional music, which marked his 50th anniversary within a couple weeks of his death. And as a professor, finally, at Berea College, his research and teaching expanded beyond folklore to embrace every aspect of Appalachian studies before Appalachian studies became recognized as a scholarly field. And still, I think his work was most folkloric, absolutely at the core, because of this constant goal that he entertained. And I don't think he articulated very often, but it was instinctive in everything he did. And the best quotation I could dig up from anything I recorded or from others was this. His goal was to have people know your own culture. It's the sort of thing Wendell Berry writes about, a place on earth, and the people in the community, and learning to get some strength from that, or at least be at ease with who you are. Now, Wendell Berry went on to say something that Loyal never explicitly told me, but always lived by. And this comes from The Lonely the House, a book that was written well after Loyal met him. And Loyal was sort of modeling what Wendell Berry said in that book. A community is the mental and spiritual condition of knowing that the place is shared, and that the people who share that place define and limit the possibilities of each other's lives. Loyal didn't merely know that the people who defined and limited his life, he knew that his neighbors did that, but he embraced that knowledge. He embraced the limitations that they imposed. The constraint of that limitation, that social contract, was like yoga for him. The greater the constraint, the greater the mutual knowledge, the greater the possibilities, the greater the freedom. Loyal knew no limitation. His limitations knew no limits. He practiced Wendell Berry's preaching long before he knew Wendell Berry. From Cherokee, North Carolina, Cherokee County, North Carolina, where he was born, to Madison County, Kentucky, where he ran into Berea, and every mountain in between, and to the sides of those two places on the way there. He became someone who embraced every limitation that he saw. It was one of the most improbable things you can imagine, to make your entire region this constraining community. But that was in fact what Loyal did, and I've never seen anyone else do it. It is the knowledge that people have of each other, their concern for each other, their trust in each other, the freedom with which they come and go among themselves, is what Wendell Berry wrote about that. And again, that was the energizing principle of Loyal's life. It was Loyal's and even more Berea's luck that Loyal went there. We heard earlier about the John C. Campbell Folk School. Loyal was actually at a library there, reading everything he could about Appalachia, and told by the librarian at the Campbell School that he ought to go to Berea, that they had even more books there, and that's where he would learn about these things. So he actually went there first with a folk dance group that was practicing in North Carolina to compete, or at least share those dancing experiences with the Berea students. But he came in 1950, and he stuck around then in Berea for the next 60 57 years. Berea was born from and lived largely up to some of the best ideas that anybody ever had. Founded in 1855, when Kentucky was still a slave state, Berea was integrated from day one, open to everyone, no matter how poor, nobody paid, everybody worked, and it's a place that still merits a measure of awe. And it has been a place that's where, at certain times, in certain important corners, the community that went there literally overwhelmed the classroom. And especially in one classroom, where regularly the community mounted a sustained takeover of the educational institution. And this is where Leonard Roberts was teaching in the 1940s, shortly after World War II, at the college's foundation school, where mountain kids living too far from any place that could regularly attend school were just sent off to Berea. They could board there and get a daily education. And when Roberts himself, born and raised deep toward the head of Toller Creek in the mountains of Floyd County, Kentucky, found that he could not get his students interested in writing about anything, he picked up a copy of Richard Chase's book, The Jack Tales, which had been published just 3 years earlier, and started reading from it in hopes that that book could engage the kids. And it did, but not as anticipated. The kids were critical. That guy got it all wrong. My grandmother tells that one better than he can. It wasn't long before the kids were leading Roberts into learning experience, teaching him how the tales went, where they came from. And before too long, Roberts was following the kids back to their homes and recording their families. So Roberts, the student of the mountain kids, became a model for Lloyd Jones. In one of the 4 models that was celebrated in his last book, titled My Curious and Jocular Heroes. And all 4 of those heroes were highlighted in that book. Cratus Williams, Bess and Lamar Lunsford, and Josiah Combs were all people born in the mountains, often self-educated, went on to become very big people from where they were, but were heroic, largely in the fact that they all told spectacular stories from where they came from. So the book gives you the official biographies and then tells you the stories that Loyal loved and learned from them. And I think it's a spectacular work. Again, his last published book. So Loyal learned much about the promise of Berea and those subversive corners that could make it a more fantastic place. But Roberts was no longer at Berea when Loyal arrived there in 1950. And when Roberts told Loyal why, many years after the fact, Loyal's mission was set. He began to know what he had to do. In the heat of his excitement over the folk tale telling students, Roberts got the strength up to secure a meeting with Berea's president. The missionizing educator, Francis J. Hutchins. And he went before Hutchins and began narrating the kids' miraculous enthusiasm for these stories. The foundation, the college itself, already known as a center for folk crafts and folk dance, could become a center for the verbal arts of mountain life. But Hutchins cut Roberts short, and Loyal's words about this are branded in my memory. And he told him in no uncertain terms that he was a perfect example of what the college was working to move beyond. Loyal couldn't repeat that sentence without revealing a tinge of very uncharacteristic anger. And Roberts himself never recovered from that dissing. He went on and became a spectacular folklorist, a field work that Henry Blassie, for one, cites as one of the 3 homegrown folklorists who transformed what we think about when we try to describe a communities culture. But then he went on into education and got thrown out of or fired every college that fired him, every college that hired him. They were all in the mountains: Union College, Morehead State, West Virginia Wesleyan, Pikeville College. They all fired or were fired by him. He never squared with academia, and his breakthroughs outside of academia were inspiring to the degree that his success in academic circles was thwarted. And Robertson fed Loyal's doubts about institutions that put undue stress on the higher part of higher education. And after graduating from Berea, Loyal himself worked largely outside of academia and got recruited to work in the Council of the Southern Mountains, which was headquartered at Berea but was still independent of it academically. And this was this organization dedicated holistically to bettering the economic circumstances of mountain life. And it was actually there that he met Leonard Roberts, because the tales that were not welcome at Berea were published in Mountain Life and Work, which became one of the real central places for discovery and developing all those aspects of mountain life, Appalachian culture, but never exhorted mountain people to abandon it. A few years into Loyal's tenure, Pearlie Eyre, the council director, felt a drive to finish his sociology dissertation. And he turned to Loyal and asked him to take on many of the presidential duties during the time that Eyre was working on his dissertation. Eventually, these became almost all of the duties involved with the mountains. And Loyal was effectively running the council when Eyre died in 1967. Shortly after Eyre's passing, Francis J. Hutchins, the man who had driven Roberts out of Berea, ran into Loyal on the campus, expressing some distress. How are they going to replace Pearlie? Do you have any idea who that would be? And Loyal very sheepishly said, they picked me. Hutchins looked at him in disbelief, turned his back, and walked away without saying a word. Hutchins apparently never realized that Loyal was running the organization at this time. But 3 years after Hutchins retired, Loyal went back to Berea and started teaching. And he worked to make it exactly the sort of place that would never move beyond Leonard Roberts, never move beyond him or any of their mountain families or neighbors. Beginning in 1970, he virtually created Appalachian Studies on campus simply by enacting that idea of community that he shared with Wendell Berry. So he, in essence, made a campus that was a community that just exalted in this idea that all these folks who came there could learn most by beginning with studying where they came from. But again, where Berry maintained that a community is necessarily small, Loyal made it his mission to leave nobody out. And I think this was one of the great acts of institutional subversion and academic creativity, both at once, that I can think of, greater than any other that I've had any knowledge of. This all happened 25 years before I met Loyal, but it was particularly in the memories that came in, written down in the funeral book and the memory book after he died, that I got this sense, which I may be over-idealizing, but if I am, there were hundreds of other people who wrote in with the same idea that Berea College in the 1970s was a place that just about anything was possible. And it was based primarily on the premise of Loyal's conviction that we would presume no superiority and ask students to do no more than consider respectfully who they were and where they came from. And I'm not sure anyone else but Loyal Jones could have pulled that off. I believe, again, that this is one of the great folk takeovers of academic culture. And I would love to see somebody put together a book-long study where that came from. There's a huge beginning of such a book just in the written memories and the memorial service done in December for Loyal Jones at the Union Church in Berea. The core of Loyal's verbal culture celebration mission was humor. He was anything but an angry man, dedicated by nature to the conviction that the way to respond to insults from those who put themselves above his community was to laugh them off. And he exalted in his culture's power to do just that in the most natural and understated ways, in all kinds of jokes that he listened to continually and repeated as often as he can. He did have one weakness as a narrator. Like Leonard Roberts before him, he was so delighted by the jokes he told that he often broke out laughing. He finished them. You can't pull this off in the normative style for delivering this kind of joke. In Appalachia, which was essentially a flat deadpan, you never break into a smile while you're telling the joke. Had to shoot the old dog today, Jim. Was he mad, Joe? He wasn't any too pleased. So Loyal would start laughing before that joke would blow the punchline. But the jokes that he always pulled off masterfully were the outsider, dressed down, leveling jokes. And again, I cannot tell this joke. I've heard Loyal tell it, and I cannot do it like him, but he could pull it off. A mountain boy walks into a big valley town. The first thing he sees is a bunch of workmen shoveling out a trench on Main Street. He asks, friendly, "What you all digging that hole for?" "Kid, we're digging a big hole to throw in all the stupid people." "Really? All the stupid people? Who's going to cover them up?" So anyway, Loyal would start laughing, and about half a second after everyone else did, they covered for him, and the joke came out perfectly. It always worked. He was instinctively, unsleepingly vigilant to counter snobbery. Not even a near-death experience could stifle his level of humor. Late in 2017, this was the medical disaster about which I spoke earlier, he was found unconscious, lying on the floor of his Berea home. His intestine had been perforated by a broken rib, and he lay there alone for 2 days or so. Once he was found, his daughter Susan crossed the mountains from North Carolina and tended to him in Kentucky hospitals one after another for more than a month, sleeping in his room every night, during most of which time he was absolutely unconscious. I stopped by to visit him in January 2018 on his 90th birthday, where he was about a month into this experience. It was as bleak a moment as I can remember. I've never seen a living man who looked so nearly dead. Susan was with him, of course, as she had been throughout the entire ordeal. She told me she couldn't say that he'd be coming back into consciousness anytime soon. But in hopes, I resolved to try to wait him out. She and I began talking about Loyal's years at the college. The topic of Loyal's old nemesis, Francis J. Hutchins, came up. I told her that back in Chicago, where I was just driving in from, I was living in the shadow of Hutchins' brother, Robert Maynard Hutchins, who served as president of the University of Chicago while Francis was at Berea. And both brothers were known as academic missionaries, and the Chicago Hutchins shared the Berea Hutchins compulsion to better everyone. He was going to make you better no matter what, and only he knew what better meant. If Francis Hutchins was going to make mountain people better than they were by forgetting where they came from, Robert Hutchins was going to better them by having them read the great books. 54 giant volumes that he cooked up with Mortimer Adler and the board of the Encyclopedia Britannica to make sure that everyone who wanted to be anyone in this country would have the same broad humanistic education. They marketed the great books everywhere. Every Sunday morning when I was a kid, it seemed for years, I would open the Sunday funny papers and find right across the page from Prince Valiant a full-page ad for the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, free of charge to anyone who would subscribe to buy the other 53 books. Robert Hutchins would make you better, but only on his terms. And one of the leading terms was that you had to abandon physical exercise. My father, who had gone to the University of Chicago, hated him with a passion because Hutchinson had banned campus sports. A severe blow to Dad, who was the rarest of all people. He was a University of Chicago jock. So the Chicago Hutchins was famous for dismantling the program and also for saying, whenever I feel the urge to exercise, I lie down until the urge passes. Within a second, out of the darkness, Loyal spoke, seemingly still in his sleep. Whenever I feel the urge to read Marcus Aurelius, I lie down until the urge passes. And coming from a man who'd been flat on his back for 30 days, this was pretty amazing. So, Susan and I broke up, absolutely. And after this verbal flash, Loyal grew quiet again, and he seemed to drift again completely out of consciousness. He never got too close to death to miss the cue for pretension, belittling jokes. This was the single greatest act of comic heroism I ever encountered. Loyal's riposts were never aggressive. They were never defensive, but they were perfectly proportionate. They were short, summary, and usually the last word. What is your comeback to a line like, whenever I feel the urge to read Marcus Aurelius, I lie down until the urge passes? Loyal could do that, turn it off and on, repeatedly, all through his life. On this one verbal path, he was the consummate trickster, and a unique one. The most common tricksters in Appalachian oral tradition are tricksters by necessity, like the little kid who needs to figure out some way not to be crushed by the giant, or tricksters by compulsion, like the local liar who cannot tell the truth to save his life, or anybody else's. And one of the typical stories about this I've heard in at least half a dozen Appalachian communities, riding by a neighbor's house, the trickster hears Jim calling from the porch, "Stop them, come on in. Joe, tell us one of your final lines." "I can't, Jim. I'm in an awful hurry. Your son just had his arm cut off by a saw, and I'm after the doctor fast as I can." Jim runs off in the direction that Joe was riding from and finds his son perfectly okay. I've spent time in community after community where this joke, this international tale type, is told as a true story, and is always attached to the great local liar who has recently passed away. But Loyal did not indulge that kind. He did indulge some of the tricksters by necessity in the folktales that he rewrote for children. But these tricksters, no matter what they were up against, never killed the giant. And the giant never killed anybody. He rewrote all of these things so that he could have even the fiercest kinds of threats not necessitate violence. They were never aggressive, as I've said before. So again, he had this one kind of trickster that he dealt with. But there was another level at which Loyal was a trickster. And it was in another genre. It was a mountain specialty that Loyal loved and played with continually. This is the tall tale, in which the trickster is the narrator. The narrator creates the fiction, and the trick is that the wild fiction that the narrator creates is a personal experience that actually happened to the narrator. In this, Loyal did what so many tall tale tellers did. You feed off a bunch of pre-existing tales or motifs, and you wind them together and trade them around in such a way as they eventually become a unique story. And Loyal was absolutely loyal to all these traditional techniques. And I think it's important to dwell a little bit on this tall tale phenomenon, because it really, in some ways, inscribes Loyal's idea of the community from the inside. If we look at the leveling jokes, they're boundary-keeping jokes, making sure you can feel secure with who you are, because the people putting you down can't do as well as you can. But inside the jokes, or the tall tales themselves, there is a self-characterization of the culture that needs to be thought about a little bit. Forever, the tall tale has been described as the perfect American genre, peculiarly so. From long before the time that Goffman put together his index of tales and motifs from North America and from England, essentially Old World English speakers to New World English speakers, where in his survey of the tales that he retrieved from archives and publications from the two different sides of the Atlantic, he found that the American tall tale motifs were represented by 100 times as many sources as you could find in the old country. This is phenomenal disproportion, which does have to be accounted for one way or another. But the mass culture and a disappointing amount of the scholarship devoted to the tall tales concerns itself with images of bloated figures, these enormously bloated bodies like Paul Bunyan, or these bloated egos like Davy Crockett in the mid-19th century almanacs, neither of which figures make even a dent in the body of, I'd say, maybe 1,000 tall tales that Roberts recorded in Berea College or had written down by his students. I still haven't made my way through them, but there's almost no sense of either one of those kinds of tall tale figures there. The Kentucky tales are overwhelmingly of one type, and I doubt if you would find much variance from this type anywhere else in Appalachia. First, to note, the hero is a perfectly normal person, and there's only one of them, utterly alone. There is nothing inherently magical or powerful in this person, and it's only in certain circumstances where the plot demands it that this figure turns out being resourceful or intelligent. Mainly, that person is there to set the stage for something huge that's right behind. Second, all of the plot complications come from nature. Nature is in the foreground. The human cowers at its feet. Nature comes in two forms: the magically, impossibly bountiful nature and the magically, impossibly threatening nature. And there's an all-out war between the two, and the human is shunted back and forth between these enormous, oversized warring forces. The normative style of the mountain tall tale is again understated in an almost unflappable voice, a deadpan so steady and monotonous that instead of impossibilities of nature, the listener feels as if the narrator is reading aloud from a phone book. If the key performative tactic of the tall tale is to treat the most extreme exaggeration as an everyday fact. The purpose of the core content is to enhance every exaggeration and to pit the exaggerations against each other. The dominant plot complications all come from nature itself, in conflict with itself. The tall tale that best celebrates this tension is often known as the marvelous hunt or the lucky shot, after its lead motifs, and there are hundreds of tales in the Roberts collection that represent one or more of this constellation that follows. Like Lloyd Jones and everybody else, I just sort of look for the ones that are there and go with them. The one I'm putting in front of you right now represents pieces or more or less all of at least 700 tales that exist in the Roberts collection. So if I'm the narrator, I'm remembering early last spring in my cabin where a tough winter with roof-high snowdrifts has barred my door for months. The snow's finally melted, there's no food left, and I'm on the verge of starvation. Normally I'd be wary of hunting because I've only got 2 bullets left for my double-barrel muzzle-loading rifle. But I don't have a choice to be too deliberate in what I'm doing because there is no food in my stomach or anywhere that I can see. So I begin moving in the woods, listening for the first sight of one moving thing, or the first sound that predicts one, that one shot that can save me from starvation. Suddenly the woods are rustling on all sides. Straight ahead of me there's a bear the size of an ox, charging me on its hind legs. I've only got one ball in my rifle, so I rush to tamp a second ball down on the other barrel because I'll need 2 shots. Out of the corner of my left eye, I see a panther, a gator, the size of a wagon, running at me. But while my ramrod's still stuck in the right barrel, out of the corner of my right eye, there's a bear-sized boar running at me. Doesn't matter how many bullets I have, because there are too many targets, and besides, the bear is already close enough for me to feel his breath on my face. The ramrod, still in the right barrel, flies out and skewers the bear's eye, just as he's swatting down with his paw in a stroke that splits the 2 barrels apart. The bullet flying out of the bent left barrel catches the panther between the eyes, and the bullet that's behind the ramrod on the right side flies out and drops the boar. With all 3 of these giant creatures dead at my feet, I hear a chorus of tortured quacks coming from across the river directly in front of me behind the bear. I see where my ramrod, after passing through the bear's skull, has perforated the webbed feet of about a dozen ducks perched in a row on a log on the far side of the river. So I wade over and club the ducks with the butt of my bent-up rifle. And then I wade back with them, still skewered like a kebab on the ramrod. Once I'm back on dry land, I feel a tickling in my boots, so I pull them off and shake out 15 pounds of fish. I skin the bear and lay the skin out flat with the carcass in the middle, and then pile the boar, the panther, the ducks, and the fish on top of it. And I cut some thong from the edges of the hide and fashion a harness for myself. And then I start trudging back slowly downhill toward the cabin, dragging hundreds of pounds of meat behind me. It starts to rain, and the hide sled gets too heavy to move in the mud, and the leather harness stretches. So when I make it back home, breathless, all that meat is still up in the woods. I'm too tired to go back for it, so I sit down on my cabin step and wait to die. Then the sun comes out and shrinks the hide harness, just as I'm breathing my last gasp. 1,200 pounds of bear, boar, panther, duck, and fish come sliding down the mountains. Bang right in front of me, up to a stump where some of the meat goes flying, and a fish lands in my mouth. I start chewing away, can't wait to cook anything at this point, but I lived, and from that time on, I've never been hungry again. So this marvelous, I'm sure you've heard one or another version of this, it goes everywhere. This is the one that most constellates the stories that Leonard Roberts got. This marvelous hunt, the last bullet, the magic bullet, this nature of the tall tale entails all the prodigious powers of nature to overwhelm, terrify, and kill. They dominate for the greater part of the narrative, and only when the hero is down past his last chance does some strange mix of luck and desperation kill the beasts and finally bring them to the point where he survives. At the end of this tale, as in the great majority in Robert's collection, the bounty of nature finally meets, finally wins after tough competition. Such elaborate tall tales possess this deeply satisfying ending. You're not supposed to smile as you tell them, you're not supposed to smile as you hear them, but they're retold with the kind of satisfaction that something has happened that really needed to happen in a place that really needed something good to happen. And I remember at one point hearing a narrator in French Canada tell a tale that went on for 2 hours, a fantastic tale. And the three folklorists listening were all engaged, but the grandkids were playing over in the corner, the rest of the family walked away, they had nothing to do with it. And I asked him, this is great, you could tell this to me all day long, but why do you still tell these tales to yourself? And he said, there has to be some place where everything works out the way it should. And that does seem to be what Loyal Jones is holding up, and which the tall tale tradition does hold up in the mountains. It is absolutely unblinkingly realistic about the horrors you can meet there. But every once in a while, someone gets away, and one person does it, who knows, maybe it can happen again. So I've heard people who had left the mountains, resettling in Florida or Arizona, tell such tales as bridges to their former lives, a tie to the now physically distant wilds that they revisit only in memory and imagination. They were supremely satisfied through these tales that the mountains were still there, and equally satisfied that they were not. But for Loyal and others who seldom physically and never spiritually contemplated ever leaving the mountains, the tall tale was as much an act, it was less an act than a fact. The tale of the mountain and the horrors you reach there is not that far from the truth. And I don't know any place else on earth where tall tales are told like this in the concentration that they are. I've heard similar plots in southern Louisiana, East Texas, Indiana, Illinois, etc., but not where they were simply what you spoke about time and time again. And I think this leads us inevitably to the fact that the social contract that Wendell Berry and Loyal Jones celebrated was inevitably also inherently, inescapably, a natural contract. In Loyal's world, again, the people are far more numerous than in Berry's world. Berry talks about a small community where the surrounding nature is everything they have. That contract of restraint is based on what they can get from that immense land. In Loyal's world, though, the people are far more numerous, but the land is infinitely larger, so huge as to dwarf the people and to separate them, just as much as comprising a commonality. They are effectively communally living alone. No matter how interdependent, they were equally and each one solely dependent on the scale and power of the mountain world around them. And it's that unique mixture of the tightness of the community and the expansiveness of the world that both joins them and separates them, that comes out in these stories that Boyle says, and that is just inherent in the tall tale. The tall tale scape presented in the mountain narrations was the absolute picture of this sense of a close community that was intermittently morphing into a community of one, going back and forth, turning the switch on and off. The sense of aloneness in nature that could alternately elate and depress. The mountain simultaneously completed your community and cut you off from it. This talescape seems to grow from and into the shapes and surroundings of mountain childhoods. In the 1960s, Robert Coles conducted a nationwide study of the children of poverty. Migrants, Sharecroppers, and Mountaineers was one of this book in a collection of volumes titled Children of Crisis. And he crossed the country to learn how children from economically challenged families experienced home life. In each environment, among city dwellers, migrants, and sharecroppers, he asked the children to draw home. Show me what home looks like. So they made these literal pictures. In Appalachia alone, among all the places he visited, the drawn images showed tiny houses dwarfed by trees, water courses, and most especially mountains. And in a significant number of the Appalachian drawings from Logan County, West Virginia, and Martin County, Kentucky, the kids drew no human-made structure at home. Home was a mountain, a stream, or a forest. Salak, one of the figures he quotes from Martin County, Kentucky, drew a mountaintop, and she narrated why. I like to go to the field there, on top of the hill, and look out. You can see far, far away. You're closer to the sun. You're nearer the sky. Once when I was real little, my grandma took me up there. Things were not good in the house. My mother was crying so hard, I thought she turned into water. Grandma took me on her shoulder up there to the field. She put me down and told me, stand there, don't move. She kept pointing at one mountain after another, this one and that one, and if the mountain had a name, she said what it was. She told me never to forget that we had this field to go to, and you were able to see as far as anyone on God's earth can see. And if you lose your spirits, go up there and talk to God. He'll hear you from that field if he's ever going to. So the essential enormity of the mountains was necessary for, better or worse, necessarily part of your home. In his tall tales, in his leveling jokes, Loyal sought to make his mountain neighbors at least at ease with where they came from. That was his motto for what he was doing. In his tall tales, he sought to make them at ease with their awe of where they came from. He took equal delight in both company and awe. Both were essential. He was as much as saying, you'd better be at home with your awe, because the source of your awe is your home. I believe that the last 5 years of Loyal's life were an extraordinary gift after surviving this horrific situation. A gift you could easily call divine, the gift of his family's loving care, and the gift of his own strength of will. He had things he wanted to do, and he did them all. On Loyal's 90th birthday, that day when he spoke that one sentence about lying down until the urge to read Marcus Aurelius passed, Susan told me what had happened when Loyal first came to after his near-death experience. Nothing could convince him that he had been found on the floor of his Berea home. He knew where he had been. He was certain he'd been driving snow-covered mountain roads in the Cumberlands when his car slid off the pavement into an icy stream. He refused to believe that his memory was playing him false about this. Terrifying as this vision was, it gives me a strange but real comfort to think that he experienced his close call in the midst of those imagined mountains. He'd been on his chosen path for a very long time, and he was going in the direction of where he'd come from. The motto of the Council of the Southern Mountains went, "The mountains are a feeling." That was a motto they had actually before Loyal came around, but it may have been his. And Loyal felt his mountains as powerfully as anyone could. He described his birthplace as, quote, "in the cradle of surrounding mountains" in North Carolina. His greatest comfort in the Kentucky Senior Living Facility, where he recovered from his 2017 fall, the only comfort he found there actually was the sunset view of the western slopes of the Cumberlands. You could barely see them from there. That's where he fixed his eyes, and that was the only thing he talked about that he'd like to see. And on October 7, 2023, Loyal passed away in the shadow of Black Mountain, North Carolina.
Thank you for that tour de force. Would you be willing to take questions and comments?
Surely, it's easier than reading that. I'm sorry, I got a little emotional while reading that. So.
So I'm really interested in the muted affect. When I teach folk cultures in Appalachia, and I ask my students to think about verbal art or collective verbal art, they really want to find like a legend or a folk tale or something like that, right? And I try to suggest that really the most interesting tales that are circulating are personal narratives, narrative jokes, and tall tales as a combination, right? But I wondered, you talked about like the distribution of tall tales, right? If you have ideas about why those genres are so prevalent in actual kind of lived experience, and also how does the muted affective delivery have anything to do with that? I mean, because I can see that it would kind of encourage listening, right? To be able to catch the joke when it happens, but also distinguish insider from outsider who kind of knows the genre. But is there something else going on, or?
Well, I think that those are the big things, but they definitely are shibboleths. If you're an insider or you're an outsider, depending on how you respond to that. And I do think that there are also cues about how to listen in the nuances between a real experience and an imagined one. Because the really great tall tales tellers try to make no distinction whatsoever. So, for example, Leonard Roberts' wife, Edith Roberts, in her 90s, I was talking to her about things that were going on in the mountains and mentioning some of the tales from around there, and mentioning the one about the hoop snake that did its tail and rolled down the mountains. And she said, "I always thought that was true." It's a great fog. And part of it is that for them, it is a fact instead of an act, in the sense that the possibilities, the elemental possibilities, what can happen to you there, and what you can see there, and what you can do there, are not things that normally fall within the contemplation of people from outside there. And it's quite common that these cut down lines and that the tall tales grow right out of an everyday conversation. So that I think you're absolutely on in terms of identifying those particular genres as being all of the piece. But in giving yourself as the narrator of that, you are saying that this is all mine. And there there are different ways. I mean, there is that braggart, half alligator, half snapping turtle thing, but there is the humble, always losing narrator who gets continually stomped by these forces, who's a real force in this tale telling, and I think some of the best examples come out of that.
I love the account of the Hutchins brothers. Because I remember my father-in-law, who attended the University of Chicago, this became almost a family legend, that at one point Mr. Hutchins summoned all the students to some central meeting point at the university and declared that there would no longer be a football team. I love that idea. Wouldn't happen here at Harvard, though.
He may have met my dad.
Yeah, I thought of that, yeah. Sarah, did you have something?
Just, I wondered if you could share with us your favorite memory of Loyal.
Well, I think you've heard a bunch of them there. There's,
Is there anything that didn't sneak in?
Pardon?
Is there anything good that didn't sneak in?
Or more jokes.
More jokes.
I can't retell his jokes. I just can't do it. I'll send you a book. But the problem is, the jokes he wrote down couldn't touch the ones he spoke. And I was after people all the time, recording. And he did not want to be recorded. He wanted to inscribe them in a certain way. Now there are those tapes that were made early on as cassettes, I don't know if they're still around, titled Laughter in Appalachia, where he and Billy Edward Wheeler go back and forth and tell some. But I still don't think they touch what he could just let go of, sitting across the table from you, any given time, any given day.
Wonderful talk, Carl. Thank you. So I'm wondering is this kind of genre of lying considered to be something of the past? Are people actually, still gathering?
People are still doing it. Now, the long, elaborate ones with plots in them are more specialty stories. But the deadpan, I did this yesterday, that sort of stuff is just, it's rife there everywhere.
That's what I was trying to get at, is what's becoming of it now, or what has...
And I wonder how much the fragmentation's happening. I wish I could spend more time there. I mean, the time I spent there, I was usually talking to people who are older than I am. And there are not many of those anymore. And there was a good reason, because Roberts recorded people in the 40s who were only 8 years old, and I was able to find them at age 60 and so forth and so on. But I so much wish I could have heard some of those older folks, because I did actually hear this one old fellow in Arkansas, Ozarks. And Lloyd would say, you could airlift me into that part of Arkansas, and I would be home. It was that close. And this fellow, after 20 minutes, he could have you believing anything. So that sort of thing, with that kind of focused tour de force,